the story of the man of steel, Joseph Stalin. Joseph Vissarionovich Jugashvili, which I have no idea if I said the name right because the guy's name is practically an onomatopoeia. He was born on December 21, 1879, in the city of Gore, which is a small town that was in Georgia. And like several cities of that time of the Russian Empire, it had its own culture and also its own language. Joseph was one of the children of the couple formed by Katerina Ageladze, by the father Vissarion Zugashvili, which is very hard to say the names. And he was the only child who survived because a lot of things happened, many diseases. He himself survived smallpox, which ended up marking his face, and an elbow infection that ended up leaving his arm a little shorter. He also had to survive daily beatings from his father, who drank a lot, and in addition to beating his own son, he also beat his wife. However, his father ended up dying when he was 11 years old in a street fight, and this made his mother become a washerwoman. In fact, Stalin's mother had a dream that Soso, which is the nickname she gave him, would one day become a priest. Contrary to what many think, Stalin was always very intelligent. In a short time, he completed all the courses in his region and ended up winning a scholarship in the capital of Georgia, which was Tiflis, which was a kind of theological seminary. But he didn't get along very well because this place was dark and there was always a lot of authority and there were people reprimanding him, and he didn't like that. At first, the young Soso didn't care much about these things of authority. He even behaved well and got good grades. He was even praised, but gradually, I think he started to feel somewhat suffocated and somewhat trapped. And he began to distance himself. However, before that, in a study group he had, they began to study Karl Marx. He was very interested. He did not return to the seminary after the vacation. And he ended up in the capital becoming the spokesperson for Karl Marx. He became a Marxist. At 19, he already gave private lessons. And also in 1898, he got a job at the Tiflis Observatory. And at night, he would go to the railways to talk about Karl Marx to the workers. The next year, a very significant event occurred. Stalin ended up meeting one of the members of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. This is very important because one of the members of this party was Vladimir Lenin, someone who would be seen as a hero by Stalin in the future. One of the first roles of our dear little Stalin for this party was to write some articles for an underground magazine called Britsola. They forget that it means struggle, but one day, when he was helping to organize an event called May 1st, the police of the Tsar, who would be the Russian emperor, ended up attacking, and he fled to Batum, where he tried to organize some workers in the region. And on that day, Joseph adopted a code name, which would be Koba, which is his name when pursued by the police. In Batum, Stalin ended up causing some confusion among the police and the workers. And in the midst of all this confusion, several deaths occurred, and several arrests among the arrested was Koba, which in this case is also Stalin, if you didn't understand that it's his code name. And after a while, he ended up being exiled to Siberia, to give you an idea of how isolated it was in Siberia. It was so far away from everything that the guards didn't even need to watch so much. In fact, most of Czar's enemies were sent there, but while Stalin was in Siberia, his party ended up suffering a separation. Two groups were formed. One group believed that anyone should have the possibility to join the party. They were known as the Mensheviks. On the other hand, the group believed that only revolutionaries should be part of the party. These were called Bolsheviks. In fact, their leader was Lenin. When he returned to Tiflis, Joseph ended up aligning with the Bolsheviks, probably because Lenin was on that side, and whenever he could at meetings, he ended up attacking the majority who were Mensheviks. In 1905, due to the people's discontent, there was a march to the house of Nicholas II, who was the Tsar of the time. This march was organized by the Orthodox Church priest named George Gapon. Their goal was to ask for some improvements in the government. This march was completely peaceful. They thought that Khazar would end up listening to them and understanding their reasons. However, Nicolau ended up leaving St. Petersburg, and as if that wasn't enough, when the authorities ended up ordering the people to retreat, and they didn't accept, they ended up being massacred in what became known as Bloody Sunday. With this event, the Workers' Rebellion only ended up growing even more. And in October, when some leaders of some railway unions were arrested, the whole of Russia stopped with a general strike. And in 1905, a revolution also ended up happening, in quotes. I say in quotes because there was no fighting or weapons. What happened was some people from the Social Democratic parties formed a workers' council, which would be known as Soviets, to try to fight Nicholas II. And Nicholas II, in an attempt to balance things out, ended up turning Russia into a constitutional monarchy. And in the meantime, Trotsky, who was one of the leaders of the Soviets, along with other members, ended up being arrested. And the Tsar, Nicholas II, ended up forming an assembly which would be known as Duma. When the members of the Duma gathered, that's when Stalin first spoke with Lenin. And it was also when he was sent out of the Russian Empire to deal with expropriation issues. Expropriations were criminal acts which the revolutionaries used to get money. And just like Lenin, Stalin was in favor of these acts. When he was outside the empire, he always participated in some congresses. And at these congresses, he would always get very angry with the intellectuals who, according to him, just kept writing about the revolution, while he and other revolutionaries were on the streets fighting for the revolution. And at the second Congress that convened, Stalin ended up meeting Trotsky, and the two did not get along at all. One ended up cursing the other. Stalin saw Trotsky as utterly useless, and Trotsky called Stalin mediocre. In 1907, Stalin ended up marrying a young woman named Ekaterina. They say this marriage only worked because Ekaterina saw Stalin as if he were a demigod. She accepted his secret meetings and even prayed for him. However, one day, Ekaterina died. Stalin ended up feeling the loss and crying beside her coffin. Or he pretended, right? I don't know. Sometime later, he ended up returning to the Caucasus and ended up acting in the city of Baku, where he made the strike movement, which ended up attracting the attention of the socialists and even Lenin, from whom he received a compliment. However, as not everything is roses in life, he was again arrested and sent to Siberia, where he saw the revolution movement diminishing, but he always kept in touch with the leaders. In 1912, Stalin's party ended up having a meeting, which would become known as the Prague Conference. Even though he was absent from this meeting, he ended up being appointed a member of the Central Committee. In 1913, he decided to adopt another pseudonym because until then he was called Koba. So he decided to adopt the name Stalin, which meant steel, hardness, strength, which according to him were his qualities. The period he was imprisoned, which was between 1913 and 1917, was enough to drive anyone crazy, but Stalin ended up using this time as a kind of maturation, as if he was preparing for a position he would come to assume. Unlike the intellectuals of his party, Joseph thought that the only way to revive the revolution would be to pass power to the Workers' Party. And even in a time without friends and family, Joseph only thought about this, a way to make history. In 1914, the First War happened, and Russia was the country that suffered the most from this. To give you an idea, about 15 million soldiers were sent to war. They had no preparation. They practically had no weapons. Meanwhile, the people ended up starving in 1917 because of the situation in Russia, with the people starving and the soldiers dying in the war. A demonstration occurred, which ended up overthrowing the Czar, and a provisional government ended up taking over. The provisional government was mostly filled by the Mensheviks, who took on important roles. However, a grotesque mistake they made was to continue in the First War and continue spending money on it and not on the people. To try to please, they even pardoned some exiles. Among them was Stalin. Stalin ended up becoming the leader of the Bolsheviks, but he also managed to get into the executive committee of the Petrograd Soviets, which was controlled by the Mensheviks. So he was kind of trying to please both sides there. Until the 16th of April, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks ended up getting along. However, when Lenin returned from Switzerland, he ended up taking the reins of the situation and ended up speaking ill of the provisional government and saying that the empire urgently needed to get out of the war. And of course, he also said his famous phrase, "All power to the Soviets." At first, it was kind of hard to get the Bolsheviks to switch sides. But as Joseph and Trotsky ended up siding with Lenin, this helped a lot, especially with Trotsky, who brought many supporters. And Trotsky himself, as he is very intelligent and very organized, he ended up organizing a strike against the government. However, this strike resulted in his own arrest and also in Lenin's escape to Finland, leaving Joseph again as the leader of the Bolsheviks. In September, a general named Kornilov said he would invade Petrograd to overthrow the provisional government. This scared the government, which released Trotsky and even gave weapons to the Soviet to help them fight against Kornilov. However, the general never arrived. This only helped the Bolsheviks to further elevate the revolutionary sentiment carried by the phrase, "and all power to the Soviets." While Stalin worked in silence, being the link of the Central Committee with the Petrograd Soviet, on November 7th, the provisional government, without many problems, fell. Upon coming to power, the party became the Communist Party, and Lenin ended up becoming the president of the council, while Trotsky became the People's Commissar for Internationalities, something like that. And Joseph ended up becoming the People's Commissar for Nationalities, whose main role at the moment was to solve the issues of non-Russian people who were in the country. Lenin had some problems getting Russia out of the war. That's because Germany was really giving it to them, and the fire only ceased after he accepted some conditions, which was to give some regions of his country, like for example Poland, part of Ukraine, and some regions of the Baltic Sea. However, some people disagreed and considered this to be very bad. However, Stalin remained loyal to Lenin. He even thought he was the only one. The Bolsheviks also faced other issues. For example, Kerensky, who was recently kicked out of power and began to organize some militias to attack the government. And with that, the war between the White Russians, who were the rebels, and the Red Russians, who were led by Trotsky, ended up happening. And I think this war lasted about 3 years. And in the meantime, Lenin ended up moving the government to Moscow, where he thought it would be safer. An important fact is that even though the Bolsheviks were Marxists, their revolution did not happen exactly as Marx wanted. First, Marx wanted society to be fully industrialized before the revolution occurred, but the Bolsheviks did not industrialize anything. They simply carried out the revolution in a society where agriculture is the base economy. After all this happened, Lenin asked the peasants to take some land and give it back to him, so that he could later distribute the lands equally. However, in Lenin's division, he even ended up dividing some families, and the peasants didn't like that. But Lenin didn't care, and even used force to ensure that his system would work. And this was called war communism, and it even made some White Russians gain support. In 1918, Russia's allies at the time of the empire ended up attacking Lenin's government, trying to overthrow him. And at that time, Stalin was working in the city of Tsaritsyn, which was a very important place because if someone got there and took the city, they would end up having access to all of Russia's food supply. During this work, Stalin warned Lenin several times about the chaos in the region. There were looting, those things. He kept asking for rationing, price control, and he even criticized Trotsky. But after the white troops in Tsaritsyn were defeated, Trotsky asked Lenin to call Stalin to Moscow to give him some scolding. But Trotsky's idea didn't work out very well, because Lenin sent a special train to fetch Stalin. He was even received as a hero, and Tsaritsyn would later be called Stalingrad. While the Civil War continued, Stalin continued to participate in it and criticize Trotsky. But at that time, it didn't matter much because he ended up being praised for having reorganized the Red Army. But later, these criticisms would hurt Trotsky quite a bit. After the Civil War was practically over, the new economic policy was implemented, which would be a new economic policy. And to sum it up, the industrial sector would be state-owned, and surprisingly, the private sector was allowed in small things, including in the agricultural sector. But many Bolsheviks were against this because they thought it would give a loophole for capitalism. But Stalin continued to side with Lenin, and Russia's economic expansion at the time also helped Lenin in this plan. As Commissar of Nationalities, Stalin now needed to resolve dependency issues, which some regions of the country were asking for. At first, he gave independence to Finland. This led other regions to also ask. But he couldn't give it because some of these regions were strategic, for example, Ukraine and Siberia. So he told them that independence would only be given to regions where the majority of the people were workers. But even so, Georgia in 1918 ended up declaring independence being governed by the Mensheviks. Stalin managed to convince the others that the government of Georgia was a threat, and in this he got permission to stage a coup in the region. He used brutal and violent means, but he managed to make the government of Georgia pro-Bolsheviks. But his means were so brutal that they even shocked Lenin. But before the Soviet leader could do anything, he suffered a stroke. Knowing that Lenin was incapacitated, Stalin made a call to his wife making a threat, because he thought she was speaking ill of him to Lenin. But Lenin ended up finding out about this, and after he recovered, he demanded an apology from Stalin. After that, their relationship was never the same. And after 2 more strokes, Lenin ended up dying on January 21st, 1924. And from there, a fight for the leadership of the Soviet Union began. When the fight to see who would take Lenin's place began, Stalin was one step ahead because he was not only the Commissar of Nationalities, which gave him a lot of contact with the people. He had relationships with various Bolshevik leaders and was the party's general secretary. And several party officials ended up owing some favors to Stalin. But one thing ended up happening, which kind of hurt our friend Stalin. In a meeting that was held, a letter was read that was like a testament that Lenin had left. And in it, he said that Stalin should be out of the government because he had been extremely disrespectful. He had threatened Lenin's family. This was a huge humiliation for Stalin. The guy that he most admired had betrayed him. Stalin's luck was that several competitors for Lenin's chair ended up being afraid of Trotsky and totally ignored the letter. They thought that later Stalin would end up supporting them, but they didn't count on the Iron Leader ending up staying in power. During the meetings that took place in the party, Stalin became increasingly quiet, even when Trotsky was attacking him. But he was just studying the day-to-day of the party tirelessly. After a while, due to accelerated industrial growth, Trotsky began to be criticized, and also because he always offended his opponents, he began to increasingly make enemies. Until in 1925, he was kicked out of his current position, and he didn't even protest. When Trotsky left, Stalin managed to ally himself with a Marxist named Nikolai Bukharin, and together with him, he managed to isolate some of his remaining competitors. Some were even those who had helped him in the case of Lenin's letter. But even so, the plan worked. Bukharin even helped to maintain Lenin's economic plan, which kept the lands as private and not as state-owned as most wanted. In 1928, Stalin finally took his position and also showed his new economic plans, which had nothing to do with Bukharin's, including Nikolai Bukharin himself. Later ended up being expelled from the government and all the positions he held. And in 1929, at 50 years old, Stalin had no one else to worry about. Joseph Stalin was finally entrenched in power, and the first thing he did was to implement the first 5-year plan, which intended to collectivize all the lands and turn them into collective farms. This was nothing more than an excuse to seize lands for the state. Joseph thought that by showing the new tools and the benefits they would bring, it would be an easy task to obtain the lands. But he didn't count on the wealthier ones, the so-called kulaks, who posed a certain difficulty. And seeing this, he sent police, workers, and peasants to forcibly obtain the lands from both the rich and the poor. And with that, a war against the peasants began. Those who did not cooperate with the collective farm would end up being killed or deported to Siberia, and some would even have their properties destroyed. But despite all this, in 1930, 58% of the collective farms had families with them, working and living on them. But this came at a high cost, not only for the dead or deported, but because those who were kicked out of their own property ended up destroying it to prevent the state from having their things. And along with this, the cattle and pigs also went. This would mean that the population of cattle and pigs would take a while to recover in Russia. With the failure of the plan happening in rural areas, the then leader began to look for culprits. In some documents, he blamed some people in the party, saying they should never have used force. But it was him who used the force, right? The plan was not suspended despite the failure. And on top of that, within this same plan, an annual industrial growth of around 50% was expected. And an interesting fact is that Stein ended up criticizing Trotsky for his expected industrial growth to be around 20%. Stein probably changed his mind when he realized that his farm plan depended on machines, and the machines depended on industrial growth. In order for the plan's goals to be met, it was necessary for all workers to contribute daily and to always be encouraged. And for this, many workers were always publicly praised. And within the jobs, there was always a committee that checked if everything was going according to the plans. And during this time, many Russian workers ended up earning the title of hero. An example of this was a miner named Stakhanov. He ended up exceeding his own production by 1,300%. In his honor, the word Stakhanovist ended up gaining the meaning of worker. Despite all this, the morale of the workers only decreased more and more. This was due to their very low wages and also the difficulty of feeding and survival itself. And to try to solve this, to try to hold the people, Stalin ended up creating the internal passport to know where each person worked. Stalin began to industrialize quickly, which led to several mistakes. And like any crazy leader in the world, he blamed anyone for this except himself. The goal of this first plan was to modernize the entire country. In this, schools were built to produce more and more skilled workers. Literacy plans were thought out. Factories were placed in strategic regions. In case there was a war, it would be easy to defend them. And railways and highways were also built. There was also Plan 2, which was much more chill, but also several large works happened. For example, the Magnitogorsk Industrial Complex, the construction of the canal between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, among many others. The evolution that occurred in the Soviet Union because of this was surprising, so much so that they even tried to continue with Plan 3, but it didn't work out because of an event that happened in the world. Despite the terror Stalin spread throughout his country, the results of his policies were undeniable, so much so that he was able to produce oil and among other things. And he even managed to compete with Germany in terms of industrialization, despite people not living in as good conditions as they did in Germany. But the farms were already able to produce enough food to combat hunger. Now, shifting the focus to Stalin's personal life, in 1919 he ended up marrying a woman that I will call here Nadez. But that's not her full name. Her full name will be on the screen. This woman, she used to walk among the workers to know how things were going. And once she ended up knowing about the brutalities that Stalin did in the first 5-year plan, and she was extremely shaken and even went to complain to him. But he simply ignored it, which made the marriage much worse. And once, I think in 1932, at a party, Stalin drank too much and ended up scolding her, and she was extremely upset and ended up running away and even killed herself and left a letter talking about the things Stalin did, which deeply affected him. In a meeting that took place a little time later, he ended up resigning from all the positions he held. However, a guy who was present at the meeting, who was called Mstislav Molotov, ended up telling him to stop, that the party was totally on his side. And that sentence would end up saving Molotov's life. In Grandisburgo, after that passed, Stalin ended up creating a persecution mania. He thought that all people were against him, especially after the assassination of the leader of Leningrad, which was done by a student that ended up leaving in Stalin's head that he could be the next. And in this began the Grandisburgo, where several people who were against the government or suspects were always detained, arrested, or even executed. He even used the secret police, and it was a police created by Lenin to fight the capitalist troops that entered the country. But with Stalin, the function changed a bit. This police now had to hunt down the enemies of the people, whoever they were. Citizens could be arrested for having opinions contrary to the government, or having secretly traveled abroad, which completely terrified the people. The government always hid the real numbers of prisoners, and people were forced to believe in the official releases, which had much lower numbers, and also in those so-called public confessions, which were made by people who were tortured or had their family threatened. Stalin remained at the Black Sea during this entire time, and the one who actually took care of Grandisburgo was Nikolai Isov, who was the head of the secret police. That's why this period got its name, which I won't say here as it's difficult, but I'll display it on the screen. And it's important to mention that not even members of Stalin's party were spared from this Grandisburgo. Stalin's strategy of being completely absent during this period in the country, it put in the heads of even the prisoners that maybe he wasn't involved in all this. Meanwhile, abroad, he always gave a good image to the interviewers, who described him as simple and kind. And in the Soviet Union itself, images of him always appeared next to farmers who were happy. And because of this, he ended up self-proclaiming the great father of the people. But of course, there was always someone who knew the truth. And in this case, there was a guy named Bukharin, and ended up traveling to Paris. There he ended up giving an interview, and in it they asked him why he thought even the Bolsheviks were involved in the Purge. And there he answered the following: Stalin is an unhappy person. This unhappiness comes from the fact that he knows he is not the most powerful person in the whole world. This unhappiness is also the last vestige of humanity. Inside him, what is not human but demonic is the fact that he always wants to keep taking revenge on everyone. Just someone speak with greater clarity than his, that someone will be shot. He will never let someone live who proves to him that he is not the first or the best in the world. Bukharin ended up being shot in 1938. And because the government is always fudging the numbers, it's impossible to say exactly the real number of prisoners, but it's estimated to be between 7 and 23 million. And one of the main crimes was the so-called Trotskyism. Speaking of Trotsky, he ended up being assassinated as well. When he was on the run in Mexico, when a special agent from the Soviet Union was sent there, he ended up getting close to Trotsky, entered his house and killed him with a pickaxe. In fact, he ended up falling on several papers that he was writing about Stalin's crimes. When Stalin returned to his post, he changed the head of the police and also shot the old one, who in this case was Yesov. And after that, he said that the reason was that he killed several innocents. While Stalin was fighting with real and unreal enemies, a certain guy was coming to power in Germany. This guy aimed to wipe out the communists and also reclaim territories that Germany had lost in the First War. This forced Stalin for the first time to make treaties with non-communist countries, such as the United States. When the Munich meeting occurred, which gave the Sudetenland region to Germany, Stalin ended up not being invited and felt betrayed. He also ended up fearing that Germany itself would end up invading his government. This was because he was in a moment of difficulties, not only because of industrialization, but also because of the damage of the Purge in his army, which ended up taking away several generals, and without these generals, Germany would end up running over his government. And so the Soviet leader sought contact with the German leader, which ended up generating a non-aggression pact between the two, and also a division of regions, for example in the Baltic countries, and in Eastern Europe, and even in Poland. When the war started, both the Soviets and the Germans ended up invading Poland, and the two ended up meeting there in the middle, which ended up creating a somewhat tense atmosphere. Meanwhile, Stalin also put some troops in the Baltic countries to try to invade Finland. But when he did that, he ended up getting beaten up, and the German leader ended up seeing this and thought that Stalin couldn't even last 5 minutes in a fist fight with him. Things were getting more and more tense for the Soviet Union. Germany began invading European countries, but Stalin refused to break the non-aggression pact. And the two countries always ended up trading products. But the products from Germany to the Soviet Union began to take longer and longer each day, and Stalin only made a formal protest to try to avoid a war contact. Let's say the only thing he did was to make a non-aggression pact also with Japan, or a neutrality treaty to be more precise, to avoid thus two war fronts. But sometime after he received the Japanese diplomat, Germany and the Soviet Union were at war. The German army began the invasion and was divided into 3 battlefronts, one in Ukraine, one in Moscow, and one in Leningrad. She did this with the intention of also dividing the Red Army, to then crush everything at once. And at the beginning, it was a complete beating from the German army. And despite Stalin alone becoming hysterical, in public he always appeared confident. Despite Stalin's strategy, called Scorched Earth, where his army as it retreated would destroy everything in its path, leaving nothing for the enemies, the situation was still quite ugly. Leningrad in Ukraine had been taken. The German army was 50 kilometers from Moscow, 50 kilometers from certain victory. They even ordered a bombing of the Kremlin, leaving few people there, including the state. The remaining people helped to build trenches and also to dismantle industries and take them inland. And as soon as the enemy army tried to advance, they had to face a chill of minus 40 degrees and also a Soviet counterattack that would result in a victory for the local people. While on one side the Germans were suffering from cold and hunger because of the scorched earth tactic, those who were dominated, the Soviets, in certain regions suffered any kind of atrocity because the Germans saw them as inferior beings. When the Germans tried another attack on the outskirts of Stalingrad, things got really crazy there because neither of the dictators wanted to lose, because whoever lost would have a defeat, not only military but also political. And the Soviets had to retreat to the center of the city, and the order was not to retreat any further. Mines were installed in the buildings. Snipers and even the workers were forced to enlist. The following month, the Germans were basically controlling all the strategic points, and the desperation was so great, that some Soviet soldiers put some grenades on their bodies and threw themselves at some German tanks. When hand-to-hand combat began in the rubble, the Germans were already suffering more to conquer some blocks than entire countries. And in this, Stalin always said, do everything. Stalingrad cannot fall. While there was a battle in Stalingrad, General Zhukov was approaching from behind the Germans. And on November 19th, when he attacked, the German troops were completely surrounded, and the Soviets won, and Stalingrad survived. The defeat to Stalin was the worst defeat of the German dictator. It was a political victory for Stalin. He didn't even leave his post. In 1943, he declared himself Marshal of the Army. On top of all that, he shattered the myth of the invincible German army, burying it in the rubble of Stalingrad. This victory also changed Stalin's view of the people's enemies. He even released some people from the gulags. He also ended up becoming a symbol of hope for the Russian people. Many things changed. For example, the church returned. The Tsarist regime would now be considered part of the Soviet people's history. The anthem became more nationalist, and even the army hierarchies returned. After Stalingrad, the Germans even tried to attack again, but they ended up being smoked out. The Soviet Union was already almost on the final offensive. And although the fall of the German demon is the result of the union of several leaders, we have the three most talked about, which are the big three, right? Which are Franklin Roosevelt from the United States, Winston Churchill from England, or the United Kingdom if you prefer, and of course Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union. Churchill, despite being anti-communist, saw no other option but to ally with the Soviets, while Roosevelt had even made a treaty to help the Soviet Union with some supplements. By allying with these two, Stalin had two objectives. The first was to guarantee some regions that were in a treaty, and the second was through the invasion of France to divide the German troop. In 1942, Churchill went to Moscow to talk to Stalin, and this conversation was about the division of the German troops, which was promised would take a little while. Stalin was a bit upset at first, but after he read the Allies' plan, which was about North Africa, he understood. One detail is that this conversation happened right when the Germans were trying to advance to Stalingrad. In 1943, when the three ended up meeting again, this time Stalin had the advantage, since his troops had defeated the Germans in Stalingrad. And when Roosevelt planned the invasion of France in the spring, Stalin said he would help in the war against Japan. In addition, he conquered the borders of Poland in his own way. On this occasion, both Churchill and Roosevelt spoke well of Stalin. They even praised him for his victory at Stalingrad. Churchill even gave him a gift, which was a sword. And despite the Soviet dictator speaking well of his allies in public, when he was in a private setting, he spoke ill of both of them. In another meeting, they ended up discussing some post-war terms. For example, the division of Germany among the three countries. In 1845, there in the Kremlin, they raised a toast to thank for the victory. This victory greatly boosted the prestige of the Stalinist government, leading them to hold a parade in celebration. As everyone should know, after all this, two superpowers emerged in the world, which were the Soviet Union and the United States. But the United States, compared to the Soviet Union, was pretty chill. When on the other side, it was totally devastated, since the Germans, when they were fleeing, destroyed everything they found along the way. With that, Stalin started demanding more from the people, starting the fourth five-year plan, where the focus of production was coal, oil, and steel when the Americans began the Marshall Plan. To rebuild post-war Europe, they also intended to help the Soviet Union, but it, in addition to denying the help, also made other countries deny it as well. In addition, contrary to the Potsdam Agreement, Stalin put some pro-Soviet governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and even in East Germany. And as Churchill himself said, an iron curtain descended on Eastern Europe. And on the other side, Harry Truman, who was now the President of the United States, began to support some governments as well, such as Greece and Turkey, in addition to, of course, practically all the movements that were anti-communist, and Germany was now divided into 4 parts. Each one, for each victorious country, I say 4, because now France was in the middle too, and Berlin, which was the capital despite being in a Soviet region. It was also divided into 4 parts, or was it? Until the capitalist countries decided to join their sides at this moment, Stalin got angry and decided to block access to Berlin. But through air support, Berlin remained out of Soviet power until 1949, when the blockade was lifted. After learning about the existence of bombs with great atomic devastation power, Joseph asked his scientists to also produce them. In 1949, the Soviet Union was the second country to announce having atomic power. Stalin even had problems with other communists, such as Tito from Yugoslavia, who refused to sign a treaty that he thought was disadvantageous, since Tito wanted to apply his own way of socialism. And another was Mao Zedong, who was kind of upset with Stalin because he never recognized him. In fact, Stalin always recognized his enemy, which was Chiang Kai-shek, who was a nationalist. But Stalin had a specific case with Mao Zedong because of the size of China's territory that could threaten the Soviet Union. Stalin and Mao ended up meeting a few times, and even some agreements came out of there. And even though they said they were separate nations, Mao was always called manipulated by Stalin. The victory in the war gave a boost to Stalin's image, which reached the level of Lenin's image. He always appeared in the images with a lot of vitality despite already being somewhat old. He never stopped wearing his marshal's uniform until his death. And even in other communist countries, the image of Stalin was seen. They even called him the greatest leader of all time, of all peoples. His image began to become somewhat omnipresent. There was always some giant and colorful poster, or some statue, which were always present in the mountains or in the forests. Encyclopedias and histories began to be rewritten to give more attention to the communist regime and some characters. The old images that showed Trotsky, Lenin, and Stalin now began to disappear with Trotsky. When he was nearing the end, Stalin was mentally and physically weak. He always slept late and complained when he had to work late, but he always left a light on so that people could see from the window that he was there working. Occasionally, or rather quite frequently, he would have dinners with his staff. These were feasts of food, so much food, that the dinners would go on until 4 or 5 in the morning. The purges continued, even though the numbers were greatly reduced. And besides, Stalin always put pressure on his colleagues, making them fear that one day the trust he had in them would end. And as time went on, Stalin became, let's say, more prejudiced against people of Jewish origin. To give you an idea, 25 intellectuals of this origin ended up being shot and being called, in quotes, enemies. And a lot of people ended up being scared, but even so, sometime later, to be more exact, on March 6, 1953, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin died. While the Kremlin Square was full of people mourning the event, there in the gulags they were celebrating. After his death, the name Stalin began to disappear from everything, and they even started to say that the famous enemies never existed. Even the current party leader, Khrushchev, was showing all of Stalin's crimes. Stalin's body was removed from Lenin's mausoleum and placed near the Kremlin wall, and his statues also disappeared, leaving only one in his hometown Agor. It's no lie that Joseph Stalin transformed an entire land of peasants into a great power, and that he also helped win a war, but he also tortured, imprisoned, and took the lives of millions of people. Some call him a great leader, others call him a great murderer.